do it. Let it rip. We're talking impeachment. Hey, I'm Mike Gilliam in the CUNY TV studios in the shadow of the Empire State Building in New York City. Welcome to Let It Rip. Arguably one of the most important topics in Washington, across the country, and around the world is the current impeachment inquiry taking place on Capitol Hill. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi announced the formal impeachment inquiry in September, and it's moved forward very quickly. Democrats say they have no choice but to take up impeachment following revelations that the president pressured Ukraine, a foreign government, to investigate his political rival and possible opponent in the 2020 election, Joe Biden and his son Hunter, for corruption. They say he's again inviting a foreign government to get involved in our election, to dig up dirt on the Bidens. Most Republicans have stood by the president. Some even going so far as to suggest the president was joking about some of this. And President Trump has called it another hoax by the do-nothing Democrats aimed at removing him from his duly elected office. Only two presidents have been impeached, Andrew Johnson and Bill Clinton, and neither of those resulted in the president being removed from office. Most believe the Republican-controlled Senate, which is where a trial would have to take place, would never remove Donald Trump from office. Here to discuss where we stand now and the impeachment process, we have two guests. Distinguished professor at CUNY Law School, Ruthann Robson, and the former executive director of the New York Civil Liberties Union, Norman Siegel, who I should add spearheaded the historic New York campaign for the impeachment of President Richard Nixon. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michael.
Good to have you here. Okay, let's start right off with Speaker Nancy Pelosi's announcement.
The actions of the Trump presidency revealed the dishonorable fact of the president's betrayal of his oath of office, betrayal of our national security, and betrayal of the integrity of our elections. Therefore, today, I'm announcing the House of Representatives moving forward with an official impeachment inquiry.
So, Norman, what changed with that announcement?
What changed with the announcement was an official stamp on the impeachment inquiry. There's a lot of court challenges now, and the courts have said if there is an official impeachment inquiry, the subpoena for documents, it's more likely the court would grant Congress that right. You have to remember there is a potential claim down the road of obstruction of Congress, as it was with regard to Richard Nixon in 1974. So once you had that Pelosi making that statement, it became the first step in a three-step process with regard to impeachment according to the United States Constitution, Article 1 and Article 2.
So it strengthened their position?
Definitely strengthened their position. Thank you, Michael.
Okay. Professor, tell me about the process going forward from there.
So the process would be there's an investigation and there would be drawn up articles of impeachment. What are exactly the problems that the House of Representatives thinks could be grounds for impeachment? This is a little bit different from Clinton, where we had an independent prosecutor who really drew up the articles of impeachment. But so here the House of Representatives would do it. Then they would vote on which ones to go forward. Then it moves to the Senate. And the articles of impeachment are really, you might want to think of them as an indictment. It moves to the Senate.
Majority vote.
Majority vote, yes. So, and in the Senate, it is a 2/3 majority have to vote to, quote, convict, but really not convict, it's removal. And importantly, removal is really the only thing that the Senate can do in terms of penalty. So there's the possibility of prosecution for other crimes later.
Okay.
Also, they could disqualify someone from ever running for any office again.
And that's a simple majority vote.
Okay. Now, this all started with the whistleblower who had secondhand knowledge of what went on in that phone conversation with the president of Ukraine. That's where it all began. But shortly after all of that happened, after we knew that was out there, the president doubled down on the White House lawn. Let's hear it.
Well, I would think that if they were honest about it, they'd start a major investigation into the Bidens. It's a very simple answer. And by the way, likewise, China should start an investigation into the Bidens. Because what happened in China is just about as bad as what happened with Ukraine. So I would say that President Zelensky, if it were me, I would recommend that they start an investigation into the Bidens.
Norman, is that impeachable behavior?
I believe so. The grounds under the Constitution are treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. Now, that third category is vague, but we have some historical context for it. And also, you have to remember that the impeachment process comes from England, where their process was you can impeach someone in the House of Commons and then try them in the House of Lords. And there was a case there where somebody who was in power put one of his opponents in jail. And so therefore, the case law says that abuse of power could be a high crime or misdemeanor. Nixon, abuse of power with regard to Watergate, with regard to surveillance on political opponents. So once you begin to involve a foreign country with regard to investigating your political opponent, I believe that's an abuse of power. I think, therefore, it is under the category of high crimes and misdemeanor. Therefore, Michael, that is an impeachable offense in and of itself.
Okay, what do you think, Professor? Is it impeachable?
I totally agree, but I would slightly disagree with your statement about here's where it all began.
Okay.
Because I think that there have been so many things that have happened. And one question really is this just because it was secret and now we have whistleblowers coming forward? And therefore we agree that maybe something was wrong? Is it really the straw that broke the camel's back, that all these other things have happened? So I think that there are really so many things. There are the emoluments clause issues in terms of not bribery, but sort of a prevention of bribery, taking money from foreign governments or domestic governments, thinking about the hotels, things like that, obstruction of justice.
And one of the hotels things was that people might have been renting blocks of rooms and not even using them, right?
Not really.
Well, the president of Ukraine, in one of the statements, he said, "Oh, by the way, Mr. President, when I was in New York, I stayed at one of your hotels." So it is all the game of pay to play and quid pro quos. All those kinds of terms are being used now, and it's all present in the facts surrounding Trump and his administration.
And we haven't even mentioned campaign finance.
I know. They have the votes to pass this in the House. What do you think is going to actually happen in the Senate, though? You have a Republican majority there, and you have Mitch McConnell saying he, by law, has to do a trial.
So I think predictions are really fraught, that we really don't know what will happen. Yes, it's unlikely. You need a 2/3 majority, as we were saying before. But we've seen people change. It may be that people do want to save their own careers. Anything could happen. Odds are he would not be removed. And let me also just add, this is not just about President Trump, that there are all these other players here. There's the Attorney General Barr, there's Secretary of State Pompeo, there is the Vice President Pence. What did he know? When did he know it? So there's a lot going on.
I can remember, Michael, when we began the impeachment campaign in the summer of '73, and it ended on August 9th, '74, when Nixon resigned. And when we began, first, most people, even in the civil rights, civil liberties community, didn't know what impeachment was about. I think we faced the same problem here. And people were saying to us in the beginning of that campaign, "You're off the wall. It's never going to happen." And little by little, in educating the public, and if you have trust in the public, they begin to understand what impeachment is about, why it's important, and how it can be employed. And then second, following with the professor's comment, as we got closer and closer, and with regard, especially when the Supreme Court said to Nixon, turn over those tapes, you saw Republicans all of a sudden begin to turn on President Nixon. This could happen again here, but even if it doesn't happen, it's important to inform and educate the public, not only what happened in Ukraine, but as the professor said, all the other issues. And anyone who hasn't read the Mueller report, just read Volume 2, the first 10 or 15 pages where they summarize 10 obstructions of justices in situations, and you begin to see the picture of what's been going on for almost 3 years out of the White House.
Do you think that should be included in the articles of impeachment?
I do. I think that historically there's never been a impeachment against the president where there's only one article of impeachment. Charles Blow yesterday made a recommendation, move forward on the Ukraine, but keep bringing impeachment proceedings so you can deal with emoluments, you can deal with obstruction of justice, abuse of power. I think what I loved about what we did back 25 years ago was the idea of educating the public about what happens to their government and the officials in government who abuse their power. Impeachment means holding them accountable, not only for now, but for historical purposes. My grandkids have to learn what happened during this period of time.
Okay. I want to play a clip from Lindsey Graham. He's kind of been all over the place here. First, he didn't support the president, didn't like him. Then suddenly he played golf with him, and he's a staunch supporter now. Listen to this clip.
You don't even have to be convicted of a crime to lose your job in this constitutional republic. If this body determines that your conduct as a public official is clearly out of bounds in your role, because impeachment is not about punishment. Impeachment is about cleansing the office. Impeachment is about restoring honor and integrity to the office.
So clearly that's not him talking today.
It's Clinton.
Okay. What do you think about that?
So I would like to say that I think that the sex scandals, the sexual abuse of power, the interwoven with the campaign finance of President Trump also needs to be part of impeachment. Just all of those assaults, the Access Hollywood tape, yes, was before the campaign. The lies that the president has said about Stormy Daniels and other women while president, and part of the impeachment against Nixon was public statements that were lies, and also Johnson as well. And so I think that that needs to be part of it as well.
But if it's not going to lead to his removal from office, some would say, what are we doing here? Is this just political theater or something to rev up the bases for 2020? What are we doing?
Absolutely not. This is really crucial to what America is about and uniquely about. We take the rule of law seriously in America. And even a federal judge yesterday in New York rejected the argument that you can't even investigate a president. Trump's lawyers were making that argument. It got thrown out. Hopefully it will be affirmed by the Second Circuit and even the Supreme Court. It is important for our history and our legacy to hold people accountable even when they're the President of the United States.
Professor Norman? Great conversation. I want to thank you both for coming in here. We're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we'll get a feel for how some are viewing impeachment on the streets of New York. This is Let It Rip. Hi, I'm Mike Gilliam, and the show is Let It Rip. We're coming to you from New York City with a viewpoint that goes beyond the headlines. We're talking politics, the economy, social unrest, the things that matter most to you. It's called Let It Rip. Come join us for the conversation. Welcome back to Let It Rip. I'm Mike Gilliam, and we're digging deep into the impeachment story. We've talked to the lawyers. Now we want to get a different perspective. With me now is political strategist and community organizer, Omowale Clay. Welcome.
Thank you.
Good to have you here. It's been a long time.
Long time.
Yeah. When you talk to people on the streets, what are they saying about this?
Well, I think they see it, hopefully, that Trump could be removed. I think they see Trump as a very clear and present danger to their existence. Why? Because he's very clear in terms of choosing sides. They understand the lingo and the jingles and the slogans, "Make America Great Again," means it doesn't include them. Mm-hmm. I think the concern is, though, how do you get him out? And so I think there's some lessons to be learned and taught around the American political structure. In fact, I think Trump has demonstrated to a lot of folks who are not really keyed up and educated on actually how this structure actually works, the idea of what an impeachment is, Does it mean if he's impeached, he's removed? You know, we're dealing with generations now. The Clinton issue.
But are you hearing this across the board?
Well, I think across the board is the idea that they hope Trump is removed because they see Trump as a clear and present danger because of his racialization of the political office, and it's much more clear. The language is clearer. It's less deceptive. Hillary, who many people in our community feels was not a legitimate choice for black people in our community, I think, but much more suave, much more not as in your face, but policies-wise, not really fundamentally different in terms of what's happening in the country, particularly in terms of the political economy of the country. So I think on the street, people see they see Trump clearer because Trump's language is clearer. But I would contest this, that over the past decade, there has been, in my community, in the black community, there has been an idea to disappear us, to remove us from the conversation, per se. And so therefore, you see different kinds of expressions of bring black back, the idea of the reminiscing about the Black Power movement. But all of those are identity issues to bring people back into the fold because we're being disappeared. Other than entertainers and athletes and such in the black community is literally under siege. In fact, I had a conversation a little while ago with one of the former guests around the question of even what's going on in our community. It's not a question of gentrification is actually a question more of ethnic cleansing across the country. So when they say somebody come on board like Trump, who talks directly to a base that has been ideologically programmed in terms of seeing things in race, they're concerned. In fact, I might even express the New York Times a couple of days ago had an article about a police chief in Bordentown, New Jersey, who made the statement that Trump is our white people's last chance.
He used that during the campaign.
Right. And so he mouthed that, you know, and they put him off the force. He had assaulted a young black man. But the term, I think, the white people's last chance is a very important one. So for how that reads in our community is this guy is a danger. If things didn't get better for us under Obama, if it didn't get better for us prior to that, the bottom line is he is a clear and present danger.
But at the same time, those who support him are in lockstep with the president. I want you to listen to Mitch McConnell here. He's actually fundraising off all this.
Nancy Pelosi's in the clutches of a left-wing mob. They finally convinced her to impeach the president. All of you know your Constitution. The way that impeachment stops is when a Senate majority with me as majority leader. But I need your help. Please contribute before the deadline.
What do you think of that?
They're circling the wagons. You know, they're circling the wagons. You know, Trump is not an ideologue. You know, I almost think Trump is more like a grifter. But the reality is, though, what he represents at this time is a necessity. The American political economy is in decline. That's a fact. Around the world, people look at the United States fearfully from the point of almost, particularly in Africa, around recolonization, the necessity for recolonization to prop up the economy. So if we don't look at Trump as as a entertainer or as a figurehead, look at the structure itself. And I think that's what's very important to look at, the direction that the country's going.
One of the things he's doing is he's tweeting an awful lot right now. And part of the tweets that caught my eye was when he went into this whole thing about civil war. Let me read the tweet to you. If Democrats are successful in removing the president from office, which they never will be, it will cause a civil war-like fracture in this nation from which our country will never heal. And that was a quote from Pastor Robert Jeffress that he retweeted, okay? Now, he has been known to speak to white supremacists through Twitter just by kind of a wink and a nod, that sort of thing. The Oath Keepers, a militia group, immediately put out a tweet that said, here's the money quote from that thread. This is the truth. This is where we are. We are on the verge of a hot civil war, like in 1859. That's where we are. And the right has zero trust or respect for anything the left is doing. We see them as illegitimate, too.
choice.
Let me play a clip from Roger Stone here real quick. I have a question for you after that.
Okay.
They lost. Their candidate had every advantage. She spent $2 billion. He spent $275 billion. Sorry, he whipped her ass. It's over. You lost. Try to impeach him. Just try it. You will have a spasm of violence in this country, an insurrection like you've never seen.
What do you make of that? Do you think that this president has the power to start a civil war if he's removed from office?
The idea of talking about the mass base of a civil war between the right and, quote, the left, I think is a distraction. I think it's a fundamental distraction. The politically...
Scare tactic, too.
Scare tactic. It's a scare tactic. And it's to get his base up. I mean, you know, if we're correct, in the last election, he lost by the popular vote almost 3 million votes. But the authors of the Constitution was very clear. Don't put popular vote and let the people themselves decide what's going on. They don't really know what's going on. So let's have some backup, like the Electoral College. We have to change things around. But I think his appeal is a really huge distraction, that his terminology, his tweets, the press has played a tremendous role in diverting the real issues of what's going on in the superstructure of the United States. When Trump is gone, and he will be gone at some point, when he's gone, the person who comes in after him in that managerial position will be in a stronger position in terms of the adjustments of this superstructure in this country to quell or repress dissent. And I think that's the real question. This country's move to the right isn't a personality question. It's a necessity question because of the decline of the American empire. That's what's going on. And they're now fighting for this redivision of the world. Their competition with China is very serious in the question of, will the dollar dominate the financial markets in the future? And
do you think he'll be removed?
No, I don't. No. In fact, I think he'll be reelected.
Okay. So if he won't be removed by impeachment, what is all this? Is this just theater that we're watching right now? Are they just ginning up their bases for the 2020 election? What are we looking at?
I think it's stimulating the base for the election. I think stimulating the base for election. The Republicans have circled their wagons. They're not prepared to lose power. In fact, some Republicans, as your guest had talked about, they might be on the borderline, but they're afraid that he will agitate a base to take them out of office. So the bottom line is, I think the motion around Trump is a motion towards the 2020 election.
Well, let's listen to one of his ads that he's running right now, and he has a lot of money to run ads here.
Absolutely.
Joe Biden promised Ukraine $1 billion if they fired the prosecutor investigating his son's company.
If the prosecutor's not fired, you're not getting the money. Oh, son of a bitch. Got fired.
But when President Trump asks Ukraine to investigate corruption, the Democrats want to impeach him, and their media lapdogs fall in line. They lost the election. Now they want to steal this one. Don't let them.
Projecting?
Right. Projecting directly to his base. And the irony of it, Mike, this is the irony of it, is because the corruption in Washington is so deep, Democratic and Republican. This battle for the executive branch, this battle for the superstructure, this battle for senatorial seats and stuff is still a distraction from the direction of the country. The country is moving in a more fascistic, right-wing direction out of necessity to deal with the question of what it must do to shore up its economy. And I think the issue of Trump right now, Trump will be gone at some point in time, but the structures that they put in place remain. And that's the real danger to people.
Omowale Clay, thank you.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
We're going to take a quick break, and I'll be back with some final thoughts. I'm Mike Gilliam, and this is Let It Rip.
You're watching CUNY TV, the City University of New York.
Welcome back to Let It Rip. Now for some final thoughts. Whether you support it or not, the impeachment inquiry is real, and it's here. The train is barreling down the tracks. At times, it almost feels like President Trump wanted this to happen and pushed Democrats to go this route by stonewalling and name-calling on a daily basis. Maybe he feels protected by the Republican majority in the Senate. Maybe he feels he's untouchable because he's president and can't be investigated, or because his supporters will blindly follow him no matter what. but he usually polls around 37%, and that means roughly 2/3 of the people feel the exact opposite. A lot of people are fatigued with his presidency and have a lot of reasons that they think he should be out of office. Some even say he should be in prison. And a word about the president's tweet referencing a right-wing comment dealing with his possible impeachment, causing a civil war-like fracture in the nation from which our country will never heal. Well, there do appear to be militias in the country who listen to the president and who follow his messaging, like going to the border to confront migrant caravans. People who consider themselves patriots and would take up arms believing impeachment is part of some coup, as suggested by President Trump. If that is a danger, then it's the responsibility of our government, federal, state, and local, to investigate and be prepared for any eventuality. Now, when it's not too late. But I have a hard time thinking people would destroy the country, but you never know. I saw Charlottesville. So, where does it all go and how does it end? Impeachment and removal from office would take Republican senators convicting the president in a Senate trial, and right now that seems highly unlikely. There would have to be some major revelation through the investigation for them to get on board. So maybe it all goes to the ballot box in November of 2020, which I believe is a more likely scenario. Right now, it's a matter of keeping your eyes open and paying attention so that you know what's happening in our country and with our leaders and with those who are doing their bidding. I'm Mike Gilliam. We'll see you next time on Let It Rip.